Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for today's lecture we're going to discuss the Panic of 1819 and early democratization in the United States. And now, before we begin our lecture proper, today I'd like to do a customary recap and just touch bases on what we last discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we discussed the reasoning, the rationale for the increased immigration to the United States, specifically from Great Britain. We discussed how lands that in previous generations had been used exclusively for agriculture were now being used for minor industrial workshops, and then also for larger industrial operations, and how the formerly farming communities, the members of the farming communities were forced off their lands and forced into the larger cities. Many of them simply joined the industrial workforce there, but many more simply scrounged up what they could and booked passage to the United States. And being English speakers, being native-born English speakers, there wasn't a whole lot of investigation or vetting into their background. They were just allowed to get off the boats and do as they feel. Many of them pushed westward, settling the western lands. Many of them went on to form the nucleus of the new burgeoning cities of the West. We also discussed in our last lecture the party split. The one party, the Democratic Republican Party, has swollen. The ranks of that party has swollen. Has former Federalists joined their ranks? Has the party moved from the far right to the center? To the full-on center of the political spectrum, trying to maintain their ties with the old line Madisonian, Jeffersonian principles, but also adopting Hamiltonian ideas, namely internal improvements and protective tariffs, while also championing the American agrarianism and settlement of the West. Those two ideas proved to be incompatible during Madison's era and for quite some time after, and led to the split in the party, with old school hardline Democratic Republicans moving further to the right, and at least for this time that they're moving further to the right with a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and new men, national men, while not liberal by our standard, they were liberal for their time, and their ideas on the powers of the government, with this broad interpretation, with it being the role of the government to support internal improvements in manufacturers to preserve, had the best way to prevent American dependence on foreign nations and thus preserve American liberty. They sort of moved off in the other end of the political spectrum. And now with that out of the way, I'd like to jump straight into our lecture for today. And now, Henry Clay. Henry Clay was one of the men, perhaps the most prominent new man, who championed the new economic development and national internal improvements. And again, his rationale for this was to ensure that the United States would have the ability to compete on the global stage against European nations. Now, Clay was joined by a number of politicians, including John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who supported his initiatives to fix the weakness of the Jeffersonian program and to defend the liberty of the nation. Now, Calhoun's motive was to prevent sectionalism from taking down the republic. There was major opposition to this. Many feared the introduction of money into the rural farming community, and many viewed that as being destructive to the rural farming community. And in 1819, they were all proved right. In 1819, everything that Clay, Calhoun, and the bankers of the National Republican Party, everything they were building blew up in their face. And the events of the year 1819 is known as the Panic of 1819. Now, the panic began with the state chartered banks. The federal government maintained a monopoly on the striking of gold and silver coins. The only problem with that was, at this point, paper money was becoming really prevalent in the world, and not just in the United States, but globally. And every bank was free to print its own paper money at will. Now, the state banks printed paper money and extended credit far beyond their reserves of gold and silver would reasonably allow them to do so. And in 1819, the British cotton market lost its steam, and cotton prices fell from roughly 33, 34 cents a pound to 12 to 14 cents a pound. And that was a dramatic drop in the price. It's over 50% of the price of cotton going down. That made that event, that sharp decline, that very steep decline in cotton prices, made Southern merchants in debt. It made it so that the Southern merchants were unable to pay their debts to their British lenders. The only thing they could use was paper money, and British merchants and lenders began refusing to accept anything but gold or silver from Americans. They didn't trust the authenticity of the state banks, and they also didn't trust the soundness of the state banks. Now, the holders of the notes, the merchants and so forth, they in turn went back to the state local banks and requested gold or silver to pay off their British debtor lenders, the people they were indebted to. They went to request gold or silver because they needed to pay them off, because the nature of their trade. The nature of their trade has we discussed in earlier lectures on American agrarianism and American trade. For most of the year, they were indebted to the British. Even men like Jefferson and other Southern plantation owners and stuff, other slave owners, one of the reasons they were keen for the Revolution was that if they won the war, they could simply write off all the debts they owed to British merchants. And one of the problems for the British after the war of the American Revolution was that they were not going to get the money from the Americans, and they had to add paying off merchants who had lost a good deal of money lending to a former colony. They had to add that money onto the national debt and sort of like reimburse them. But the fact that the Southern merchants were requesting gold and silver led to what's known as the run on the bank. And a run on the bank simply means that everyone was rushing into the bank to get their money out of the bank. And had that happened, had all the merchants started rushing to the bank to get gold and silver, the bank started calling in loans to the people that it lent money to, namely the farmers. The farmers, in turn, attempted to simply pay the bank back in their bank notes. But the banks, very quickly, very surely, told the farmers that the only thing they would accept was gold or silver for payment of their debts. And has many of the people who took out the loans, that they were unable to pay off the loans, the banks simply began to confiscate their homes. And in the process of this, many of the state banks were wiped out. And mainly they were wiped out when the Second National Bank, in a move to protect itself, started calling in the loans that it has made. Because again, it wasn't just the smaller state banks, the quote-unquote pet banks, that were making a lot of loans to merchants and farmers. When the British started demanding gold and silver, people who had gold and silver deposited with the federal bank, with the national bank, they went there, got their gold and silver, and to replace the gold and silver that had yet been taken out, the Second National Bank started, putting the pressure, putting the screws to the pet banks. Now, this and at this point, at this point, the economic and fiscal system in the United States was in a complete state of disaster. It was in complete ruin. Merchants were completely ruined by this. Manufacturing faltered and was ruined. Roughly a third to 2/5 of workers were put out of work. Agriculture, of course, stagnated as farmers were forced off their land. As small farmers were forced off their land, had the banks repossess the land. Small towns, particularly in the West, faced the prospect of disappearing. And a very interesting event happened in Cincinnati. About half of the town was sold by the Second National Bank solely to acquire specie, that is gold or silver money coin. Half of young Cincinnati was sold off by the bank to recoup gold and silver to keep itself to keep its head above water. Now thousands were sued and placed in prison for their debts. The bank was blamed for the calamity. The National Republicans were blamed and faced the anger and outrage of the American citizenry. Now, in their anger, the people decided that Jefferson had been right all along and that the banks were evil. Now, with all of this going on, politicians moved to step in to create what we know as debtor relief laws. And to ease the burden of the banking collapse, state legislatures began to pass these laws. In the West, where the collapse was arguably the hardest, the legislatures rescued farmers and manufacturers. Now, this happened except in the states of Mississippi and Louisiana, where the states' legislatures made no such move to alleviate any of the debtors' suffering. Now, the laws were of dubious legality because the Constitution forbids the states from passing laws which impair contracts, and debtor relief laws impair contracts outright. Undeterred, the legislature found ways around the Constitution. Now, the laws they enacted postponed the sale of debtor property. They allowed the sale, and in some cases when they couldn't postpone it, they allowed the sale of debtor property only if the sales brought in 2/3 of the property decided by a local jury. And of course, the local jury was decided by the property owners, friends, relatives, and neighbors. Now, the state courts were also closed to creditors seeking to collect on debts. Creditors were also forced to accept payments in banknotes rather than in specie. Many of the creditors, many of the lenders, many of the banks were forced by these legislatures to accept the banknote that they issued to cover their debt. Now, the states also moved to close the banks since everyone was of the opinion that the banks were the reason for these recent troubles. And in 1820, the state constitution of Missouri actually allowed for only the creation of one bank that was to be half owned and operated by the state itself. And John Adair, the governor of Kentucky, oversaw the repeal of all state bank charters except for the state's bank, the Commonwealth of Kentucky Bank. And he then used the Bank of the Commonwealth of Kentucky to issue paper money that the creditors were forced to accept under state law. Now, that wasn't the only form of relief that debtors or even the common people sought to have. Voter reform was another way to fix the collapse. The right to vote was highly restricted. It was hedged in by racial, gender, and of course property qualifications. Now, the Panic of 1819 led to popular outrage against the legislatures, which had chartered these banks in the first place. Now, the Congress, which had chartered the second bank, the monstrous second bank of the United States, also faced a lot of outrage. People began to clamor for expanded voting rights, and for the first time on a national scale, they did this. In 1821, New York abolished the last vestiges of its property qualification laws. Any white man who held property, paid taxes, served in the militia, or worked on public works could vote in New York. Virginia, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Rhode Island were the only states during this time period, during this rush in the 1820s to democratize, to give all white men the vote. Those four states were the only ones to maintain some type of property qualification. This simple act increased not only voter eligibility, but also saw an increase in the turnout percentage of eligible voters. An increase at the state and the federal level. On average, 80% of eligible voters were now voting at the state level and in presidential elections. Now, the method, these changes, these democratic changes brought on by the Panic of 1819 also hit the method of nominating presidential candidates. No longer were congressmen polled to see who they would support. That was how Madison got in, it was a simple sort of play, a simple American version of the way the British do things. The prime minister is an elected prime minister in a general election. The prime minister is a member of the House of Commons, or the prime minister could be a member of the House of Lords, but the prime minister is always that person who can garner a majority of supporters in the House of Commons. And the way it worked the way it worked for nominating a successor for Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe was that they simply polled members of the House of Representatives, and whoever got the majority of the Democratic Republican Party members of the House got into the office of president, and that changed. No longer would they do it that way. The state legislatures were now given a say on their national nomination to decide who will succeed. And then these events stemming from the Panic of 1819 slowly led to the change to the democratizing of the Republic. Now, John Marshall and the Supreme Court, they actually worked to check this democratic swing with the case of Dartmouth College versus Woodworth. And now the case rested on the state of New Hampshire's attempt to abrogate the original colonial charter for Dartmouth College and gain control of it via nominating members to its board of directors. Now, Marshall decided to use the case to defend contract law for the nation. He led the Supreme Court to rule in Dartmouth's favor, not so much because he liked the soundness of the arguments, but rather to check what was viewed as wide-eyed mobs threatening the nation. They followed that up with the case of Sturgis versus Crown and Shield, and now the case of Sturgis versus Crown and Shield revolved around the suit of protest against a New York state law that allowed debtors to obtain easy refuge from creditors. The Supreme Court struck down the state legislature statute on the ground that it violated the obligation of contract and was thus unconstitutional. The Marshall Court followed that up with Gibbons v. Ogden, which saw the Supreme Court invoke the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Now, the suit pertained to the granting of a monopoly by the New York State Legislature, and Marshall argued that states who shared waterways, aka New York or Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, states like that, states that shared these waterways had to surrender their sovereignty over that waterway and permit competition. Now, these decisions place private contract rights beyond the reach of state governments, and this outraged many old-line Democratic Republicans. Jefferson, in particular, was furious. He fumed at the fact that John Marshall could simply undo everything with a quote-unquote swing of his pen, with simply a wave of his pen. He could, in the eyes of many people, simply determine policy and determine the law, determine which laws were legal or not. Many old-line Republicans now began to think of ways of using this new Democratic majority to elect a like-minded president who would undo the national bank, corral Congress, and make the Supreme Court into a body that would defend, old-line Democratic virtues and values. Remember, Marshall was the last Federalist appointee to the Supreme Court, but Marshall served on the court from 1801 to 1835, and Marshall brought around every Democratic Republican that Jefferson or Madison or even Monroe put on the court. They all ended up voting with him. They all ended up falling into line with him. But these new men thought that if they could send people from their ranks, die-hard old-line Democratic Republicans like themselves, they could get them into the Supreme Court. They could make them associate justices, or even when Marshall died, appoint one of them as Chief Justice. Then they will be able to safeguard the Revolution of 1800. And at this point, they didn't have a candidate. They didn't have anyone that they could put that type of responsibility on. They had no one that they could have to shoulder that type of responsibility. They were still searching for a candidate. They had none, and they will continue their search. And we'll get to who they eventually decided on. But for now, that's the end of our lecture on the Panic of 1819 and early democratization in the Republic. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys found it enlightening and entertaining. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, comment. Let me know what you thought about the election of, the Panic of 1819, early democratization, and of course, John Marshall's Federalist or Republican response to the Democratic swing. As always, I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.